Hi there! With the half-hour long video crushing out its tutorial out of the way, we can finally get back to our regularly scheduled production. Or so I thought. You see, there was something that a lot of people asked me in my last video that I really hadn't considered that much up until this point. That being that if I hated power creep so much to the point where it's one of the main factors as to why I quit tutorial, how come I play so many gacha games that are notorious for their power creep? I had fully intended to blow off these comments, but then I thought about it for like 2 seconds and very quickly realized that these people have a point. How am I so willing to just completely blow off tutorial because it has a shit ton of power creep, but not other games? Especially because within the gacha space, power creep is one of the most prevalent things ever. It's right there next to daily systems and gambling. And you know, they make a good point on paper, and if you only think about it for 2 seconds. Because believe it or not, there is a difference between power creep in general and Star Rail's power creep, or just power creep in any specific game. Hell, there are even times where power creep is a good thing rather than a bad thing. I can go back and look at the history of my now private channel and see where I made a video talking about how Genshin could probably use power creep all the way back in Inazuma. I mean, I'm not gonna play the clip because I don't want to hurt any of your ears with my 17-year-old voice, but you know, I'll put it right here. There you go. Look at it. Pretty cool, right? So with that all being said, I think I'm gonna make a very fine distinction within this video, because a lot of people hear power creep and they think it's just the boogeyman that'll creep into their favorite games and just absolutely ruin it from the inside out. And I don't think that's necessarily true. Power creep is not inherently a negative thing. It can actually be a really easy way to add some spice into an already existent thing. But like most things in life, it has to be done in moderation. There's a very fine line you have to be able to walk, because if you add too much power creep, it's going to be very hard for a majority of people to keep up with it. And if you add too little power creep, it can result in what I like to call stagnation. I'm assuming a lot of you who watched this video watched my Star Rail video, which means you have some interest in Star Rail, and as we all know, a very significant portion of the Star Rail players also used to play Genshin, so I'm gonna assume a lot of you play Genshin as well. Well, if you did, then you would remember that all the way back in the era of Inazuma, we had a very long period of time where it felt like every single character that came out in Genshin was weak in some way, shape, or form, to the point where a very large portion of the community was complaining about it. It was originally a very silent minority that quickly grew into the majority over the course of Inazuma's lifespan, starting initially with Ayaka. The main reason for contention was Ayaka was a unit that came out in version 2.0 that players have been waiting for a long time, and up until that point, we really hadn't seen that much power creep at all. After the release of Ganyu, Hu Tao, and Zhao, Genshin really didn't see that many new amazing DPSs come out. I mean, sure, Eula was pretty good on release, but she didn't really get crazy out of the scaling of everything else unless you got Constellation. So with Ayaka being the next biggest cryo DPS, players were expecting her to be significantly stronger than Ganyu was, but in the end, she ended up being around similar level, to the point where it's still hotly debated to this day who was stronger, Ganyu or Ayaka. And then there's Yoimiya, who even at peak performance with her dedicated support later on performs very similarly to Hu Tao, always slightly performing under her. And then Hu Tao got Yelan, and we all know what happened after that. Hell, even the Archon of the region wasn't that impressive at the time. Raiden Shogun was powerful because she gave your team energy. Her damage itself was inherently unimpressive unless you ended up getting her C2 or her weapon. The real value of Raiden Shogun comes from her ability to vastly reduce the amount of energy recharge you need on your team, which instead allows you to invest those stats into your other teammates, which is why Raiden National is one of the best teams at the time, especially because back in this era, it wasn't common for older accounts who have so many artifacts they could god roll a character as soon as they pulled them. And then it keeps going from there. Characters like Arataki Ito, who was strong for a grand total of 1 patch before he started to fall off, Ayato, who is very frequently compared to Tartaglia, and many people said he underperformed compared to Tartaglia, and finally, my personal favorite, Yai Miko versus Fischl, where to this day, people still claim that Fischl is better, and I personally believe it. It got so bad that eventually players were just complaining non-fucking stop. The game had begun to stagnate, because at this point, it legitimately felt like no matter what you pulled, it would just be worse than what you already had. There was no real reason to pull the shiny new toy unless you needed it for some sort of elemental team comp you were building. And players who did end up pulling a character that they liked or wanted were usually disappointed when they just underperformed underperformed in comparison to the rest of their teams. With that all being said, I'm sure there's some of you in the comments sitting there typing out like, oh well, if that's the case, then what are you saying? They need to power creep like they did in Star Rail? You're just going against what you say. And that's not inherently true, because I don't think that that's what they needed to do. There are other ways you can introduce power creep to make it more of a slow burn than stagnating your game over the course of a year by refusing to add anything new or interesting. Hell, Genshin ended up figuring out on their own. With the release of Sumeru, they were able to introduce a new elemental reaction system that was able to heavily buff older characters with the introduction of Dendro. Teams like Hyperbloom and Aggravate became more powerful than they were before, essentially saving units like Kaching and, of course, Yaimiko. Even Raiden Shogun had a little bit of a second win. Ayato, though, Yoimiya, got her. I haven't even looked at him for a minute. But that's not to say that's the only way you can do it. There's actually a couple other ways. For example, I'm gonna give you all a little bit of a blast from the past here. Tower of Fantasy. Oh yeah, you remember that? Probably in shell shock now. I've actually revisited that game in recent months, planning to make one final review on it before the game ended up getting shut down. Luckily, Hada ended up reopening the servers after claiming ownership of them from Tencent, so we managed to avoid a global shutdown. That being said, I still plan on fully finishing my review. And with that all being said, in the new knowledge I've gathered, Tower Fantasy actually has a pretty interesting way of handling their power creep. Now, I wouldn't blame you if you've heard from other people who play the game, or even YouTubers that make shitty reviews, because my god, there are a lot of them. And not just on Tower Fantasy, just in general. You would think this game has some absolutely disgusting power creep that tucks you into bed before setting it on fire, and that is kinda true, but also not really. Tower Fantasy does have power creep, and yes, it is a lot of power creep. New units that come out end up doing significantly more damage than their predecessors. However, that's kind of the thing. They only succeed their predecessor. Tower Fantasy's combat system works by having 3 weapons. Each weapon has an archetype and an element. The archetypes are mostly unimportant, seeing as every single fucking unit in the game is a DPS. However, the element is very, very important. You're allowed to have 3 weapons at a time, and because Tower of Fantasy for highest DPS wants you to have mono comps, you're going to want each of these 3 weapons to follow under one single elemental archetype. And seeing as the most powerful weapons are usually the most recent ones, that usually means that if you want to run fire, you're going to run the 3 most recent fire weapons. Here's the thing though. Unlike something like Star Rail, Tower of Fantasy doesn't release 2 new characters every patch. They usually only release 1 new character every patch, which means it's already right off the bat significantly more manageable to keep up with the game's power creep. But not only that, the way the banners work is they run in an elemental cycle. Players know far in advance what the next weapon element is going to be, because it'll always run in the order of electric, ice, fire, then physical, and then altar. Which means if you are building a physical team, you know that you need to save all of your pulls for the physical element. After you pull the physical element, you're going to wait 4 months of pure saving, getting up to 200 pulls a patch, before you have to pull the next element, which gives you more than enough time to actually keep up with the game's power creep. But if you plan even smarter, you can get the altered weapons, which take on the attribute of whatever the majority element is in your party. Some of them even able to take on any element no matter what. So if you were to pull an altered weapon, you could use that weapon for significantly longer than most other weapons in the game. And the game actually pushes you into doing this, seeing as most altered weapons are the strongest. The only way you're actually going to get swept away by power creep is if you just play like a nincompoop and try to pull every single fucking weapon in the game, which I should already tell you in advance, you shouldn't be doing that in any gacha game, period, unless you like the character. But because they give you so many pulls, and because you know when you're gonna save, it's very easy to plan around pulling characters you like as well. But they actually do one more thing, which I feel like is the most generous thing they've ever done. Once a unit is a 1.5 years old, they are automatically added to the standard pool, which in and of itself probably doesn't mean anything to most of you. But Tower of Fantasy has a very unique system where you can straight up buy weapons you already own. Now for the limited banner, you need to do 110 pulls to get enough currency, and seeing as this currency expires every new banner, it's very hard to save it up for long enough. However, on the standard banner, this currency is permanent, and once one of these limited characters gets added to the standard banner, you can automatically fully get their C6 right out of the gate. So basically what I'm saying is, if your character gets power crept by the meta, and and they go on to standard banner, you can automatically C6 them, and just like that, they're meta again. Now let's pivot back to Star Rail. The reason why power creep is easily one of the biggest negative factors in that game, and the reason why I quit playing it is because they do absolutely nothing to halt the flow of power creep. There is no character getting added to standard pool so you have good options on there. There is no buying a C6 when your favorite character becomes irrelevant unless it's with cold hard cash. There is no way to predict what is and is not coming out with 100% accuracy. You can only rely on the leaks, and even those aren't very helpful. And they certainly don't give you enough pools to actually give you time to save for anything, especially with the high frequency of characters releasing in the game. And it's upsetting because there is a very easy way to fix this. Like I said earlier, Tower of Fantasy and Genshin both have archetype systems built into the game that inherently add value to a character. This helps to slow down the power creep a lot, because in order for them to raise the ceiling past what it already is at, they are going to need to raise the power creep to every other element and every other archetype first, which heavily slows down the rate at which things become irrelevant. Genshin did this when they released Sumeru, which added the Dendro system. A lot of things needed to be built around Dendro, and only at the end of Sumeru, a whole year later, when that archetype was fully expanded upon, did they move on to the Bond of Life system, releasing some of the most overpowered characters in the game, like Neuvillette and Farina. But guess what? If you compare their damage to the Dendro team's damage, there's actually not a very huge difference. And the same thing is currently happening with Natlin. A lot of the Natlin characters are objectively stronger than anything we've seen before. However, they have to be played with one another in order to be that good. And even then, the best Natlin team, which is Mavuika Hypercarry, and the best Fontanian team, which is Neuvillette Charge, when compared by DPS, are still very close, to the point where people are still arguing. And these characters and their teams have been shared a year apart. Tower Fantasy does something very similar. Before they raise the ceiling on the game as a whole, they first make sure that the ceiling of the electric, frost, physical, fire, and altered element are at the same level. Only once all 5 of them reach that new ceiling do they further increase the level of power in the game, meaning it takes about a full year and a half before power creep is even pushed that much farther. And what makes it even more frustrating for Star Rail is they already have this system built in. They just choose to not act upon it because it makes them more money. Like I said earlier, I understand that stagnation can be a problem like it was for Genshin, but if you keep that period going for about 8 months, 9 months, 10 months before you push it even further, you're not going to run the risk of players getting super upset. Here, let me give you an example. Star Rail has a couple of team archetypes, like Dot, like Hypercarry, like HP scaling teams are a thing now, follow-up teams, stuff like that. Usually in Star Rail, only a couple, 1, 2, sometimes maybe 3 of these team comps are relevant at a time. And the second they're no longer relevant, they're basically useless in the endgame, unless you have a absolute metric shit ton invested in them. This means that at one time, there is usually one overwhelmingly dominant team. For example, it was originally at the start of Penacony, DOT teams. They just absolutely beat everything out in terms of damage. And then they released Acheron, and I get it, she was a hype unit, but as a hypercarry DPS, she absolutely dwarfed everything again. And then they released Fei Zhao and Firefly. Firefly was Break. Break then became the most powerful team, and then when Fei Zhao came up, Follow-Up became the most powerful team. What they could have done instead was, instead of putting such a massive gap between every single character, they could have had all of the team comps be around the same level of power, because you already fucking have the archetype system in place. Then, what you could do is make a even level of the MOC and pure fiction content, and have it set out so that certain times it will dedicate itself more towards one of these archetypes, and then have it go on a rotation. I know they already do that now, but it doesn't really fucking matter when the new DPS is already 10 leagues above everything else in the game. And make it so that if they were all on an even playing field, it would still be possible to clear the other forms of the in-game content, even if you don't have what it already dedicates itself to. I want to be able to go into the Dot Abyss with a follow-up team and still be able to clear with like 75% of perfect play. And then, once every team comp is roughly on the same level, you can release, I don't know, Fei Zhao 2, that is just directly better than Fei Zhao, and maybe a 4-star that replaces one of the other members on the team, because that way, it's actually easy to get the character, and you're not having to roll for multiple 5 stars to build one team only for it to immediately be power creep. And if that is completely off the table, there's another thing that Stariel could do to slow down power creep and make it more of a, I wouldn't say positive, but a more manageable thing. Just give the players more pulls. If you're a free-to-play player, it'll take you 4 patches to guarantee one 5-star character. One. Most modern team comps are made of 4. If you could give 100 pulls just base for a free-to-play player and then have the paid players get one guaranteed character every patch, it would still barely scratch their pockets because they're releasing characters at such a rapid rate that nobody's able to keep up anymore, unless you're getting really lucky or spending a lot of money. It would be a good way to win back some good faith, make power creep a little bit more manageable, and stop bleeding players because, man, that player count is looking spicy right now. But that all being said, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I really have to say on the matter. I don't think power creep is an inherently negative thing. However, I do think Stariel's version of power creep is probably one of the worst I've ever seen. Well, the second worst. I'll make a video on that later. So you know the drill. Like, comment, subscribe, dislike it if you dislike it, and I'll see you later. Peace.